tourist sneered and laughed as a royal guard performed his drill, convinced that the rigid formality was comical. But when the guard finally turned, his response left the entire crowd in breathless awe. But before we continue, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you appreciate stories about respect and dignity, make sure to subscribe so you never miss one. The midday sun hovered high over the sprawling palace courtyard, illuminating the geometric patterns of centuries-old cobblestones. Tourists bustled in a swirl of colors and chatter. Some wore wide-brimmed hats and carried water bottles, while others clutched cameras, eager to capture every last detail of the imposing structure. Within this crowd, however, not everyone came with reverence in mind. Over the years, the palace had become a magnet for travelers, artists, photographers, and occasionally those seeking to trivialize its storied traditions. Stationed at the palace gates, a squad of royal guards embodied discipline at its most striking. Each wore the insignia-laden crimson jacket and tall, distinctive hat that signified centuries of continuity, bridging a storied past with the present day. Their rifles gleamed in the sunlight, meticulously maintained and held in perfect posture. Their movements seemed mechanical, but were, in truth, a testament to careful rehearsals and unwavering dedication. Their slow, deliberate pace spoke of a legacy that demanded both composure and stamina, especially under the gawking eyes of tourists who swarmed in hopes of snapping a photo of these emblematic figures. For Daniel Harrington, one of the palace's veteran guards, standing at attention every day was more than just a job. It was a calling. He was a man in his early 40s, with a sharp jaw, solemn eyes, and a bearing that suggested both physical and mental endurance. Ever since childhood, he had felt a deep admiration for the tradition of palace guards. His grandfather had once served in the same regiment decades ago. The lines on Daniel's face hinted at both harsh winters and searing summers spent stoically, standing, never losing focus. Behind his disciplined exterior, Daniel carried profound respect for the uniform and what it represented. Not just the monarchy, but the collective history of a nation and the sacrifices of countless individuals who had served before him. Daily drills followed an almost sacred schedule. At precisely the top of the hour, the guards would perform a traditional march. Tourists were often fascinated by the synchronization, crisp footsteps hitting the stones in unison, rifles shouldered. At precisely the same angle, heads never turning side to side, expressions resolutely blank. For Daniel, it was a dance of discipline, each step imbued with the pride of centuries. He had trained long hours to perfect every pivot, salute, and stance. And over the years, he had grown adept at shutting out the endless parade of onlookers. They were there. He was aware of them. But his training demanded that he never break composure, never turn his head unless commanded by protocol, never speak unless an absolute necessity arose. That afternoon, as crowds ringed the courtyard, Daniel could sense the typical blend of curiosity and occasional disrespect. He had experienced it all: the whir of cameras zooming in for close-ups of his face, the children who would giggle and wave, the braver ones who tried to tease a smile out of him, and the more irreverent visitors who made faces just to see if he would react. Normally, he simply remained still. Today, however, an energy in the air hinted that a line would be crossed. He could sense it before it happened, as he had developed a sixth sense for when someone was set on stirring trouble. Jake Saunders strode in with an air of entitlement that could be felt from yards away. He was in his mid-30s, tall, and wore a shirt emblazoned with a designer logo. Around his neck hung an expensive camera, and on his wrist a flashy watch. Jake's confident smirk gave the impression he was used to getting his way, or, at least used to drawing attention wherever he went. That day, he had a personal mission, to poke fun at the stoic men in red jackets for his social media following. He pulled out his smartphone, flipping between it and his camera as he muttered quips about the mannequins guarding the palace. He honed in on Daniel, perhaps because of his position near the main gate, or because Daniel appeared the most seasoned among the group. Jake circled around, fiddling with the camera lens, talking to no one in particular, yet loud enough for everyone to hear. "Do these guys even breathe?" he asked, with a dramatic roll of his eyes. A few people tittered uncomfortably. He leaned in, carefully not touching Daniel but hovering inches from the guard's stoic face. "Bet you won't even blink," he taunted. Bystanders watched. Some were appalled, others curious to see how the guard might respond. The code of the palace guard was well known. No reaction, no verbal engagement, no sign of annoyance or amusement. Daniel continued to stand, immovable, eyes fixed on the horizon. Behind his stoicism, though, was a roiling sense of dismay. Not for himself, he had endured far worse than cheap mockery, but for the broader insult toward the centuries of solemn tradition he represented. The name embroidered on his uniform collar was not just his own, but the name of an entire institution. Jake's friend, equally emboldened, snickered from the sidelines. "Dude, try something else. Get him to flinch," the friend urged. Jake, seizing the opportunity, moved into the guard's path with theatrical exaggeration. Daniel had begun a slow march forward, part of the scheduled rotation, stepping in perfect rhythm as he transitioned from standing post to marching. Jake stepped backward in the guard's route, arms out, adopting a mocking imitation of the guard's precise stride. The spectacle drew more onlookers, some pulling out phones to record. A few giggled, but many looked embarrassed for the man acting so foolishly. Jake turned to address the miniature audience forming around them. "They train these guys to ignore everything. Let's see if it's true." He waved a hand exaggeratedly in front of Daniel's face. "Hello? Earth to soldier." Another round of awkward laughter rippled through the group. One child clung to her mother's coat, peering up at Jake with confusion. In her young eyes, it wasn't the guard who looked silly, but this grown man trying desperately to get a reaction. Despite the strangeness of being harassed at close range, Daniel's training held firm. He had confronted rowdy drunks and rebellious teenagers before. None of them had managed to make him falter. He inhaled steadily, focusing on the slow, measured movements of his own body. A single unplanned twitch could ruin the discipline he had cultivated over years. The camera flashes continued. Onlookers commented in hushed tones, and a short distance away, a few of Daniel's fellow guards marched onward with mechanical precision, unaffected by the scene. Displeased that no reaction was forthcoming, Jake escalated. His hand moved even closer to Daniel's face, a show of utter disrespect. Jake then spoke to his phone camera. "So guys, here we have a prime example of outdated tradition. This guard is literally paid to stand still and not talk. How insane is that? It's 2025, and we still have guys in fancy hats marching around with guns they probably can't even use." An older man near the back, who wore a lapel pin shaped like a medal, stiffened. He had served in the military years ago, and the sight of a uniform being disrespected made him fume inside. He debated intervening, but he knew palace protocol. The guard would handle it with unwavering composure. Interference might only inflame the situation. He watched, jaw set, as Jake continued. Jake turned the phone on himself for a selfie-style commentary. "You know, I've always wanted to see what these guys do if you push them hard enough. We're about to find out. Stay tuned." He winked at the camera, then turned to face Daniel again. He inched even closer, leaning in. "Come on, you can at least say hi. Are you a robot? Blink twice for yes." Daniel's stoic face glistened under the sun. The hours of training had hammered into him one principle above all. Do not let external provocation break your bearing. He could hear the man's mocking voice just as he had heard countless others, but he refused to yield. The weight of the rifle on his shoulder felt simultaneously reassuring and heavy, a tangible reminder that he was entrusted with something bigger than himself. The honor of his post, the line of guardians stretching back hundreds of years. This silent refusal to engage only spurred Jake's arrogance further. Bored with simply taunting, Jake looked around, searching for a more outrageous method to claim his prized reaction. The crowd parted slightly, giving him space. He cleared his throat, as if about to make a grand announcement, and declared, "All right, folks, time for the big test. Let's see if we can get some movement out of Mr. Stoneface here." With that, Jake unhooked a water bottle from his belt loop. He held it up for everyone to see, swirling the liquid inside. A flurry of exclamations broke out among the crowd. Some gasped, others yelled, "Don't do it!" The tension became palpable, as though the atmosphere itself had been electrified by his brazen disregard. The old veteran took a step forward, fists clenched, but a younger family member gently pulled him back. Jake proceeded with a theatrical flourish, pretending to sneeze. In the process, he purposefully sprayed a mouthful of water directly toward Daniel, a spectacle that was both childish and offensive. People recoiled, some letting out indignant cries. This was no longer a trivial taunt. It had become outright contempt. Daniel felt the droplets spatter across his pristine uniform, the same uniform that demanded impeccable upkeep and signified honor. For a fraction of a second, something flashed in his eyes. Disbelief at the extent of this man's disrespect. The sound of the water hitting the cloth of his jacket seemed to reverberate in the stunned silence. Cameras snapped. Someone in the crowd shouted, "That's enough!" But Jake simply stood there, smirking, believing he had won a petty victory by dousing the unresponsive guard. Slowly, very slowly, Daniel shifted. It was not the flinching recoil Jake had hoped to provoke. Instead, the guard took one crisp step back, lifting the rifle off his shoulder. The movement itself was measured, a single deliberate pivot. The hush that fell over the courtyard was profound. Even the distant murmurs of tourists in other sections of the palace seemed to fade away, leaving only this moment. Daniel turned, his head to face Jake squarely. For the first time, the two men looked each other in the eye. Jake's triumphant smirk faltered. There was something in the guard's gaze, an intensity that spoke of deep conviction, deep training, and a profound sense of duty. That stillness in Daniel's eyes was more commanding than any shout or show of force. The crowd held its collective breath. Then Daniel spoke, his voice even but resonant, carrying effortlessly through the hush. "You mistake silence for weakness," he said, each word carefully enunciated, as though reciting from memory. "This uniform I wear is not for show. It represents centuries of honor and sacrifice. Men and women have stood at these gates in war and peace, under scorching sun and freezing cold, never wavering in their duty." Jake swallowed audibly, the cockiness draining from his expression. He had not expected a coherent, calm and dignified response. Perhaps he had imagined some outraged outburst, or none at all. But the guard's steady voice carried an authority Jake could neither undermine nor match. Daniel lifted a gloved hand to wipe the sprayed water from his cheek, careful and composed. "You mock what you do not understand," he continued, "because it seems strange or old-fashioned. But traditions endure because they speak to the spirit of a people, their resilience and their pride. Every fold of this uniform, every medal, every drill, these are not empty gestures. They are a promise, a pledge to protect and uphold values, larger than any one individual. The crowd watched in reverent silence. The old veteran looked on with glistening eyes, moved by the guard's words, which echoed his own sentiments about respect and service. Tourists who had been gawking minutes earlier now found themselves deeply affected by this unplanned moment of moral clarity. Jake glanced around, aware that dozens of smartphones were filming. Instead of applause for his antics, he found condemnation in the onlookers' stares. No one was laughing or cheering anymore. He began to realize just how petty and juvenile his behavior must seem. He tried to muster a defiant smile, but it emerged more like a nervous twitch. Daniel lowered his voice. "You asked if I can move or speak. Indeed I can, but I choose not to because discipline is about choice. Strength is about knowing when to stand firm and when to speak. You can fling insults, water, whatever you like. My purpose remains the same, to guard this palace and what it represents." A hush more profound than any applause settled on the crowd. For a moment, it felt as if time itself had slowed, as though everyone were collectively absorbing the gravity of the guard's response. Even the midday sun felt less oppressive, overshadowed by the tension and significance of this confrontation. Jake opened his mouth to retort, but nothing came out. His face flushed. He looked for his friend, who had been capturing everything on camera, and realized with dismay that his friend wore a look of outright embarrassment. A few security officers, who had watched from a distance, now stepped forward to ensure no further incident would occur. They did not lay hands on Jake, but their presence was enough to convey that consequences might follow if he persisted. An uncomfortable moment lingered. Jake was not prepared for a confrontation on moral grounds. He only knew how to provoke a spectacle, not how to respond to quiet dignity. Outwardly, he managed a shrug, but inside, he was scrambling. The crowd parted, letting him slink away. He turned off his phone camera, acutely aware that this spectacle was not going to boost his image as he had hoped. As Jake retreated, a new energy rippled through the onlookers. Admiration, respect, perhaps even awe. Many had never before seen a guard speak. Some believed the guards were forbidden from uttering a word, though that was more rumor than fact. Others simply could not believe the calm eloquence with which Daniel had dealt with such blatant disrespect. Slowly, people stepped forward, giving Daniel and the other guards a wider berth. The hush persisted for another beat, as though the courtyard itself honored what had just happened. Then, in perfect precision, Daniel returned to his stance, shoulders squared. He clicked his heels and resumed the silent posture that had been the hallmark of his duty for years. A mother quietly admonished her teenage son, who had been laughing earlier. A father crouched down to whisper to his daughter about why respect matters. The old veteran nodded in Daniel's direction, tipping his hat slightly in an unspoken gesture of deep gratitude. Shortly after, social media lit up with clips of the incident, some posted by travelers who had filmed the entire exchange. The guard's calm, firm words reverberated around the digital sphere, reaching far beyond the palace gates. The footage showed Jake's increasingly desperate attempts to provoke, culminating in the humiliating fake sneeze, and then the guard's measured, dignified response. The reaction online was almost uniformly supportive of the guard. Thousands of comments praised him for embodying true strength, the kind that relies on composure instead of aggression. News outlets soon picked up the story, framing it as a modern clash between disrespectful sensationalism and timeless tradition. Pundits debated the cultural significance of tradition in an age that seemed increasingly irreverent, but most agreed that the guard had delivered a masterclass in self-restraint. Veterans groups around the globe felt vindicated, seeing in Daniel's response a reflection of the discipline taught in military training, the idea that sometimes the greatest power lies in not being goaded into violence. Jake, meanwhile, found himself at the center of a social media storm for all the wrong reasons. His channels were flooded with comments condemning his behavior, and many demanded that he apologize publicly. He faced possible penalties for harassing a royal guard. In some countries, such acts can carry hefty fines or even brief jail time, depending on the legal framework protecting official ceremonies and historical institutions. Realizing he had made a grave error, Jake tried to spin the story, but the internet rarely accepts half-hearted justifications for behavior caught so clearly on video. The palace, for its part, released a brief statement. The royal guard's duty is to uphold tradition and ensure the safety of the palace grounds. We commend our guard for maintaining the composure that has been the hallmark of this institution for centuries. Journalists sought to interview Daniel, but he politely declined every request, preferring to remain in the background. For him, it was not about fame or personal glory. It was about fulfilling the oath he had taken to serve. In the days that followed, tourists arrived in droves, some specifically hoping to catch a glimpse of the guard who had stood firm under such insult. Many approached with newfound respect, whispering in awe as they walked past the gate. Some left handwritten notes of gratitude. A few mothers quietly pointed at the guards and explained to their children why one must respect not just the uniform, but the ideals it represents. Back home, Daniel's family members read the stories and watched the viral clips. His mother, who remembered him as a boy admiring his grandfather's service medals, cried tears of pride. His colleagues in the guard had already known of his unshakable resolve, but now the world saw it too. Beyond the gates and beyond the country, the image of a guard calmly explaining the depth of his duty to a heckler became a symbol of something pure and enduring. Jake, facing mounting backlash and the prospect of legal repercussions, eventually issued a public apology. In a shaky video filmed from a dull hotel room, he admitted he had gone too far, that he had disrespected not just a man but an entire tradition. The apology was grudgingly accepted by some, while others remained incensed by his antics. The old phrase, "too little, too late," circulated in numerous comment threads, but Daniel paid it no mind. He was neither seeking revenge nor gratification. His days continued as they always had, standing guard, keeping watch, performing the dignified drill that stretched back through generations. The uniform he wore was carefully pressed each morning, the rifle always cleaned and handled with respect. His boots made the same echoing cadence on the cobblestones as he marched in precise rhythm, unbroken by spectacle or scorn. When the hour struck on subsequent days, tourists who had witnessed the earlier event returned, half expecting drama, half expecting a repeat. But each time Daniel simply marched in unison with his fellow guards, silent as always, steadfast as ever. The lesson had already been imparted. There was no need for a second confrontation. The guard's message resonated without repetition. Dignity is measured not by words spoken in anger, but by convictions held in silence. It wasn't long before major newspapers ran profiles on the concept of ceremonial guards worldwide, comparing Daniel's palace tradition to the famous guards at other national monuments. The conversation expanded to respect for service members, for historical continuity, and for the intangible value of rituals. Schools began using the video as a teaching tool, highlighting how composure can diffuse tension and how moral strength can resonate far more powerfully than physical retaliation. In social studies classrooms, children watched Daniel's calm bearing, then discussed what it means to respect something larger than oneself. Elders felt a surge of validation, seeing that even in an era of viral pranks and short attention spans, the deep power of tradition could capture the public's imagination. Parents reminded their children, often in simpler language, that real strength means understanding when not to fight. Grandparents recounted stories of their own youth, times when they had seen acts of discipline and dedication that shaped their respect for the uniform. Meanwhile, Daniel's life was largely unchanged. He woke before dawn each morning in his modest flat, made a cup of tea, read the newspaper, usually skipping any article that mentioned him by name, and took a brisk walk to the palace grounds. There he joined his fellow guards in the changing area, confirming the day's schedule and receiving updates about any official visits. Though some teased him for becoming famous, they did so with genuine admiration. Daniel usually smiled, politely, and shrugged. In his view, one moment of confrontation with a tourist changed nothing about the job he had sworn to do. The courtyard remained busy with visitors from every corner of the world. The shimmer of camera lenses and the hum of languages created a tapestry of global curiosity. And still, Daniel stood among them, unwavering. The water stain from Jake's assault had long since been washed from his jacket, but the memory of that day lingered among the crowd as a cautionary tale. A father with 2 young sons approached the gate one morning. The father pointed at Daniel, softly explaining, "Boys, this gentleman stands guard to protect a tradition older than all of us. Some people try to make fun of it, but it takes real strength to remain calm." The children nodded, wide-eyed, absorbing the lesson. Their father placed a hand on each of their shoulders, guiding them back into the throng. Moments like that, even unspoken, were the quiet affirmations that Daniel's role extended far beyond ceremony. It touched hearts, changed perspectives, and reminded people of the value of respect. As the weeks rolled on, internet chatter about the incident slowly diminished. Other stories took center stage, as they always do in an ever-churning media landscape. Yet for those who had witnessed Daniel's composure firsthand, or even through a screen, the memory endured. In a world hungry for sensational headlines, here was a snippet of real humanity, an arrogant act met not with violence but with dignity, and that was worth remembering. Occasionally a reporter would request an interview with the guard from the viral video. Each time, Palace Communications respectfully declined, citing official policy that active duty guards must remain outside the glare of media sensationalism. A few persistent journalists tried to ambush Daniel on his off days, waiting near his usual walking route, but he always managed to evade them, offering only a polite "no thank you" before quietly moving on. The stoicism he displayed on duty extended into his personal affairs. No sensational remarks, no dramatic recounting. He simply lived, worked, and carried on. As a result, the sense of myth and respect around him grew. Some even started calling Daniel a modern knight, though he would have certainly balked at such a term, because he embodied certain chivalrous ideals: loyalty to duty, a readiness to serve, and courtesy even in the face of provocation. People worldwide found hope in the story. If one guard could endure such blatant mockery without resorting to anger or aggression, perhaps there was still a place for nobility in everyday life. Jake's humiliating moment served as a cautionary example to other brash tourists seeking viral fame. It was not that people suddenly stopped filming the guards or attempting comedic stunts, but there was now a widely shared example of how such disrespect could backfire in the glare of public scrutiny. The lesson was clear: trying to tear down tradition for a cheap laugh often ends in personal embarrassment. And so, ironically, the palace gates became not just a site of historical interest, but a subtle place of introspection for visitors from across the globe. Jake disappeared from the public eye after a while, his wave of infamy having brought Kim no real advantage. Some of his acquaintances noted that he showed greater humility afterward. He ceased posting prank videos and turned to more generic content, likely aware that any further missteps could irreparably ruin his social standing. There were rumors he had made a private donation to a veterans' charity as a part of his attempt at penance, though this was never publicly confirmed. Weeks turned to months, and the memory of that tense confrontation seemed destined to become just another anecdote in the palace's long history, until a new wave of interest surged when an educational network produced a short documentary segment on the palace guards. They included the now famous footage of Daniel's measured response, layering over it commentary on the significance of ceremonial duties and the centuries of tradition behind them. This segment reignited online discussions with a younger generation, lauding Daniel as an example of how to handle trolls and bullies with grace. Hashtags re-emerged, emphasizing respect, discipline, and the value of upholding cultural heritages. In an era where quick tempers often escalated into violence, Daniel's choice of words over aggression stood out as a beacon. Social workers cited the incident in workshops about conflict resolution, highlighting how a calm demeanor and clarity of purpose can diffuse even the most provocative challenges. Teachers turned it into a talking point in classrooms. What can we learn from this moment about respecting cultural symbols and traditions? They would ask, prompting students to reflect on their own attitudes toward historical institutions. One crisp autumn morning, Daniel arrived for his shift as usual. The air was cool and carried a hint of falling leaves, though the palace gardens remained a lush green in parts. He changed into his uniform, adjusting the tall, iconic hat, making sure his jacket was spotless. Standing in front of a mirror, he gave himself a quick once-over, a routine done more out of habit than vanity. Duty, after all, began with self-discipline. Outside, families ambled about, sipping hot beverages from paper cups. Cameras flashed as always, the swirl of languages forming a kind of worldly chorus. As the clock approached the hour, Daniel and his fellow guards lined up, stepping onto the courtyard. Tourists parted to make way. An excited murmur traveled through the crowd, a possible indicator that some recognized him. But Daniel neither acknowledged nor denied that recognition. He simply took his place, face calm, posture straight, rifle in hand. He marched with the others in perfect synchrony, the bright autumn sunlight gleaming off the polished metal. The air had that crisp clarity that sometimes follows the change of seasons, and the stamping of boots echoed across the wide stone courtyard. Daniel performed each practiced maneuver with the same unwavering dedication that had guided him for years, and the crowd watched, cameras capturing every moment. Yet as he stood at attention, mind focused on the duty at hand, he could not help but feel a quiet gratitude. Gratitude that, in a single moment of confrontation, he had been able to speak about what the uniform truly meant, about what the palace and its guards stood for. He was not grateful for the disrespect, no one would be, but for the chance to affirm, publicly and clearly, that tradition was not just an empty ceremony. It was a mirror reflecting values from generation to generation. And so he stood there, unyielding, as he would for countless days to come. In his silence, passers-by found something that resonated with them, a sense of stability in a chaotic world, a testament to the dignity that lies in quiet service. Cameras clicked, children asked questions, parents offered explanations, and the cycle went on. At the close of his shift that day, Daniel removed his hat and stepped away from his post. He passed through a side entrance meant for staff, returning to the quieter halls behind the public spectacle. Another guard gave him a respectful nod in the corridor. Daniel nodded back, a mutual understanding passing between them without words. Each guard knew the significance of the post, the weight of the uniform, and the purpose behind every step they took in front of that watchful crowd. Finally, Daniel returned to the changing area, carefully stored his hat and jacket, then exchanged a few polite words with those who had marched alongside him. He made his way out of the palace, the sky now streaked with the first hints of evening. The glow of the sunset bathed the stone walls, rendering them a warm golden color. Tourists still lingered at the gates, snapping last-minute photos before heading off to hotels or restaurants. Daniel slipped into the crowd unnoticed. No grand exit, no fanfare. Just another man going home after a long day's work. But something lingered in the atmosphere, a reverence that had not existed in the same form months earlier. Visitors seemed more polite, more reverent, aware that these guards were not mere props, but living symbols of a broader narrative. Children whispered questions about the famous guard who stood up for his honor. Parents answered in gentle tones, weaving a lesson in respect into the conversation. The moral reverberations of that day's confrontation continued to ripple outward, influencing how people viewed both the guard and themselves. Subconsciously, many recognized that there was a powerful lesson to be learned. Mocking what we do, not understand, can backfire, and confronting tradition with scorn often reveals our own ignorance more than anything else. Strength, as Daniel had shown, lies not in overpowering others, but in holding firm to one's principles without stooping to aggression. In the end, the palace courtyard returned to its usual rhythms of daily marches and fascinated visitors. Over time, new controversies, new viral videos, and new distractions arrived to seize public attention. Still, those who had witnessed the guards' confrontation carried that memory with them, a recollection of a moment when a single, unwavering individual stood tall against mockery and showcased that dignity's true power is not in shouting down an adversary, but in standing calmly, speaking truth with unwavering conviction. And the guard himself, ever patient, ever devoted, wore his uniform each day with pride, ready to protect a legacy far older than he, just as centuries of his predecessors had done, and just as countless successors would do in the years and decades to come. With that continuity, tradition remained alive and well, a testament to the unbroken line of respect that survived any single moment of ridicule. As the sun set behind the palace's towering spires on that day, the last trickle of sunlight glinted off the stone steps. The flag overhead fluttered gently in the breeze, and the guards' measured footsteps slowly faded from the courtyard, leaving behind a quiet sense that something profound had transpired there, something as lasting as the very stones underfoot and as renewing as the next day's sunrise. Perhaps that is the finest legacy anyone can hope for, to stand for what is right and let the example speak for itself, echoing in the hearts of onlookers and reminding the world, for one fleeting but important moment, that honor and self-restraint do not belong to a bygone era. They live among us still, waiting for a chance to be displayed when least expected, shining a light on the best of what human nature can be. And in that final reflection, as the crowd dwindled and the guard's shift ended, there was no victor or loser in the conventional sense, only a reminder that respect is something each of us can choose, and in that choice lies a quiet triumph that can change hearts more effectively than any display of anger or force. Always remember, dignity endures long after the echo of ridicule has faded away, and true strength is often found in self-restraint. Let us know your thoughts on how self-control can triumph over provocation, and if you find these stories uplifting, consider being part of our community so we can keep sharing moments that renew our faith in respect and honor.